Hello, beautiful best friends, and welcome once again to our cozy little corner of the internet. And welcome to part 3, the finale of our deep dive into the MacDonald family murders. I hope this video finds you super well and that you're having the best week of all time, because you deserve it. If you have just randomly stumbled across this video, then firstly, hello, it's so lovely to meet you. Secondly, I would 130% recommend clicking on the link somewhere up here so that you can catch yourself up on part 1 and 2 before you continue any further and just get super confused. But if you have already seen part 1 and part 2, then hello, you already know my name is Liz and that you and me are best friends forever, and that we're also joined by our other best friend, Lily, who is probably going to interrupt this video at least 1 or 2 times. Editing Liz, let's switch to Lily cam. Are you in finale mode, Lily? You ready for part 3? Yeah. Oh my goodness, I am almost getting too good at these quick intros, am I not? Like, pat on the back, Liz. You know, like I'm 4 years old and in kindy or something. A pat on the back just feels validating to me, okay? Okay, so when we left off in part 2, in the 1979 trial of the United States versus Jeffrey MacDonald, Jeffrey himself was about to take the stand in his own defense. Always an interesting and risky choice. Am I right? Like whenever I'm reading or watching something where the accused is going to take the stand, I'm always like, oh, I can't watch. But Jeffrey took the stand, and his story about what happened that night didn't stray too far from the story that he had been telling for the last 9.5 years. He was sleeping on the couch. He woke up to Colette and Kimberly screaming. He saw 4 intruders in the living room, one of them being a woman with blonde, long hair and a big floppy hat, chanting "acid is groovy" and "kill the pigs." And then he was attacked by the other 3 male intruders. He passed out, and when he came back to, the intruders were gone. It was dead quiet. So he went and checked on Colette and the girls and found their bodies and made that emergency phone call. Hopefully that's all sounding pretty familiar to you guys by now. Hopefully not too familiar. I feel like I've repeated that so many times in this series and I probably sound like a broken record, but that is the main gist of Jeffrey's story that he had been telling for the last 9.5 years. While he was on the stand, Jeffrey was first questioned by Bernie Siegel, and Siegel, of course, was out to paint Jeffrey in the best possible light. So he asked lots of questions about Colette and the girls that Jeffrey was able to answer in a way that painted that picture of the idyllic, perfect family life. Jeffrey claimed that the reason he hadn't remarried in the years following the murders was because he just couldn't get over the loss of his wife, even though he had actually been engaged for a period in between the Article 32 and the 1979 trial. But basically it was all flowers and sunshine when he was being questioned by Segal. But then when it was Jim Blackburn's turn to cross-examine Jeffrey, things took a serious downhill turn. If you'll remember, this was Blackburn's first murder trial. So I think it was a combination of inexperience on Blackburn's part and an excessive amount of objections on Segal's part that led to Blackburn presenting the evidence against Jeffrey in a way that was strange and unusual, but it turned out to just be super effective. For instance, when talking about this bed sheet that had been found at the crime scene that Jeffrey said he had never touched that night, Blackburn asked Jeffrey, "Dr. MacDonald, if the jury should find from the evidence that there is a fabric impression or contact print matching the right cuff of your blue pajama top on it, do you have any explanation for that?" Another question he asked was, suppose the jury finds from the evidence that in the bedspread there is a thread matching your pajama top and entwined around a hair with blood on its shaft, matching that of your wife, Colette. Do you have any explanation for that? Also, suppose the jury should find Dr. MacDonald that type AB blood, the same as that of your daughter Kimberly, was found on the blue pajama top and that you were not wearing that pajama top when you went to see Kimberly. Do you have, sir, any explanation for that? Like, this was Blackburn's line of questioning, and it was complex, but like I said, it was super effective, because how do you answer questions like that? Jeffrey could give no satisfactory explanation or answer. He was totally put on the spot. And as a result, that charming, composed veneer that Jeffrey had managed to maintain all of these years started to show some cracks, and he began to get quite visibly flustered and quite angry at Blackburn during this questioning. A lot of the jury members would say in later years that they walked into that courtroom pretty convinced that Jeffrey was innocent, but seeing him get this worked up when being confronted with evidence that contradicted his story seemed to be what really turned the tide in this trial. The jury only deliberated for about 6.5 hours before coming to a decision, and when they walked back into the courtroom, a lot of them were crying and refused to even look at Jeffrey. And Jeffrey, in a rather dramatic move, decided to wear a bulletproof vest for the verdict because he said that Freddie Kassab had threatened to kill him depending on the outcome of the trial. And the outcome on the 29th of August 1979 was that Jeffrey MacDonald was found guilty of the second-degree murders of Colette and Kimberly MacDonald and the first-degree murder of Kristen MacDonald. So the jury clearly bought the prosecution's version of events, where Colette and Kimberly had been murdered in a fit of rage, and then Kristen, on the other hand, her murder had been premeditated after this. And an interesting thing to note is that while a lot of people comment that Jeffrey has this lack of affect or emotion when talking about the murders of his family, but it was only when he spoke about Kristen's murder that this veneer would slip a little bit and real emotion would show through. Judge Dupree sentenced Jeffrey then and there after the jury read their verdict, and this was something I had never heard of before this case, and I found it really dramatic. And Dupree gave Jeffrey the harshest sentence possible, 3 life sentences to be served consecutively, as in one after the other, meaning Jeffrey was probably going to spend the rest of his life in jail. But then it was like, no, he wasn't, because just like Helena Stoeckley in the last video, when it comes to the legal activity in this case, it's always like, but wait, there's more. Jeffrey's conviction was reversed by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1980, based once again on this argument that his right to a speedy trial had been violated. And so Jeffrey was released and he went back to work and everything, just living his normal life for years. And this part of the case just blows my mind, because it wasn't like Jeffrey was released because he was found innocent all of a sudden, like there was this evidence found that exonerated him or anything. It was because the Fourth Circuit had ruled that his rights had been violated. So St. Mary's Hospital in California literally had a man heading up their emergency medicine department that had been found guilty of murdering his family. And they were just like, yeah, but it just took so long, so everything is fine. Mind blown. And Jeffrey continued working at St. Mary's until 1982, until the Supreme Court turned around and said, you know what, actually no, your right to a speedy trial wasn't violated, and he was sent straight back to jail. It wasn't until 1983 though, 4 years after he had been found guilty of murdering his family, that his license to practice medicine in California was revoked. And it was this same year, 1983, that a book about the case was released called Fatal Vision by Joe McGinnis. And I hope you guys are ready for some drama. Joe McGinnis was commissioned by Jeffrey to write this book. So Jeffrey had allowed Joe into his fold and let him in on the entire defense case for the 1979 trial. Like, Joe had literally lived with Jeffrey and his defense team during that trial. So he was let in on absolutely everything about the case. And Jeffrey and Joe were like thick as thieves. So Jeffrey thought his mate Joe was going to write this epic novel all about how he was totally innocent, and this novel was going to help him get released once and for all. But during an interview just before the book was released, the guy interviewing Jeffrey was like, so you know that book Joe is writing is all about how you're guilty as sin, right? And that was when Jeffrey realized that his magnificent plan had just severely backfired on him. Joe's book, Fatal Vision, portrayed Jeffrey as a narcissistic sociopath that had killed his family in this amphetamine-induced fit of rage, because Joe found out that Jeffrey had been taking diet pills leading up to the murders, and it was said that overuse of these pills could result in psychosis or rage reaction in susceptible individuals. The very next year, this book, Fatal Vision, was turned into a miniseries that was watched by just millions upon millions and millions of people. And this miniseries was very controversial because it showed Jeffrey's character murdering Colette and the girls, something that was said to be way more damning to his case than his guilty verdict ever could have been. Jeffrey's appeal process had barely even begun, but now they were never really going to get an unbiased jury because so many people had seen this miniseries, to the point where Jeffrey was quite widely known as the Fatal Vision Killer. Jeffrey sued Joe McGinnis in 1987, claiming that Joe had pretended to be his buddy and given Jeffrey the impression that he believed he was innocent well after the point he decided that Jeffrey was guilty, just to leech more goss for the book. This lawsuit ended up being settled out of court after a hung jury, and Joe handed over a handsome $325,000 to Jeffrey, which Mildred Kassab, Colette's mother, promptly sued him for. Mildred ended up settling for $80,000, which she then donated to United Way of America in honor of Colette and the girls. Some of the money from the settlement also went to Jeffrey's mother and Jeffrey's lawyers, so Jeffrey himself only ended up getting about $50,000 from the lawsuit. Now, after Jeffrey went to jail, Helena Stoeckley made another appearance into the spotlight because, of course, she's Helena freaking Stoeckley, right? If you saw part 1 and 2, there's no way you didn't see this coming. So Helena sat down for a recorded interview with Detective Prince Beasley and another man named Ted Gunderson, who had originally worked for the FBI, but was currently working as a private investigator for Jeffrey to help him prove his innocence and overturn his conviction. And during this interview, surprise, surprise, Helena pulled yet another 180. She said that she had lied on the stand at Jeffrey's trial because she was terrified of incriminating herself and going to prison. And also she was currently pregnant, and the group that she was in the apartment with that night, the ones that had actually murdered Colette and the girls, they were part of a satanic cult. And this cult had made threats against her unborn baby if she spoke up about what had happened that night. But guys, Helena was overcoming these obstacles to speak up and tell the truth anyway, because she firmly believed that Jeffrey MacDonald was an innocent man and that he deserved to be set free. She confessed in the interview once again to being that woman that Jeffrey described as having the long blonde hair and the big floppy hat, that she was chanting "acid is groovy, kill the pigs," and that she was just innocently walking around the apartment holding her candle while the murders were taking place. Helena spoke about things that she had seen in the apartment that night, like Valentine's Day cards in the dining room, the rocking horse in Kristen's room, and seeing Jeffrey sleeping on the couch before he was attacked. Like, definitely things that seemed like she would only know if she was telling the truth and she had actually been there that night. So there are two things that lend a little bit more credibility to the statements Helena made in this interview versus statements that she had made in the past. Firstly, she said that she was 3 years stone cold sober. And secondly, not long before she sat down for this interview with Beasley and Gunderson, she had been declared sane and of above average intelligence by a psychiatrist. But during this interview, not only was Helena's version of events different yet again from every other time she had confessed to being in the apartment that night, but her story did not match up with Jeffrey's at all. She said that after knocking Jeffrey around a bit, this group that she was with, the satanic cult, demanded a prescription of Dexedrine off Jeffrey. And so Jeffrey was like, okay, I just need to make a quick phone call. And when he went to use the phone, they realized he was calling the police, so they beat him up again. But meanwhile, Jeffrey, in all of the times that he has told his story about that night, has never once mentioned a conversation that he had with the intruders or a second beating. There's also the issue of Helena's motives behind this confession, because Helena herself on the tape says that in return for sitting down for this interview, Prince Beasley and Ted Gunderson had promised her immunity to help her relocate, to give her a new identity, a new job, and off camera, it went even further than that, because they also offered to pay for her medical treatment and accommodation and sort out her husband's bond jumping charges that Beasley himself had arrested him for just days before Helena sat down for the interview. And they offered her a role in the movie about the case that they were trying to get made. Also, while the interview videotape itself only lasts for about 40 minutes. It was filmed over 3 days and then spliced together. And Helena said that over this 3 days, she was interviewed from the early morning hours right through to the late evening or even after midnight. She also told people that Beasley had repeatedly threatened to, quote, bust her on drug charges if she didn't cooperate with them. And after the interview, she wrote Gunderson a letter telling him that she felt he had misconstrued and distorted all the statements she had made to him to be used at his convenience. Helena finished up this letter by threatening Gunderson with legal action if he ever approached her again about the MacDonald case. So basically, I really feel like this big confession of Helena's, just like all of her other confessions, needs to be taken with just a serious grain or two of salt. Sadly, Helena actually died not long after this interview at just 32 years old in really tragic circumstances. She was found by a maintenance worker in her apartment several days after she had passed away from a combination of pneumonia and liver cirrhosis. And she was survived by her infant son, who was in the apartment with her all that time and was found under his crib. Freddie and Mildred Kassab, Colette's parents, passed away within months of each other about 10 years later in 1994, having spent nearly the last 25 years of their life fighting for justice for Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. Before they died, they were so convinced of Jeffrey's guilt that they had the names changed on Colette and the girls' headstones from MacDonald to Colette's maiden name, Stevenson. They also wrote this really scathing letter to any parole board that in the future was deciding if Jeffrey would be released early or not, and their recommendation was that Jeffrey was a psychopath that should not be let loose on society until he was rendered harmless by old age. When Jeffrey first became eligible for parole, though, in 1991, he didn't actually apply, probably because it likely meant having to admit that he was guilty of murdering his family, something he refused to do. Instead, Jeffrey continued his fight to have his conviction overturned, and he got a lot of help from a woman named Catherine Courage. In 1995, a book called Fatal Justice was released by two of Jeffrey's biggest supporters, Jerry Allen Potter and Fred Boast, and it was meant as kind of a clapback to Joe McGinnis's book, Fatal Vision. And it was this book that prompted Catherine to write a letter to Jeffrey, offering to help him in any way that she could with his fight for freedom. Catherine and Jeffrey had actually met decades earlier, but when Catherine reached out and wrote this letter, the two struck up a friendship, which then turned romantic, and the two ended up getting married in 2002. And Catherine has easily been Jeffrey's biggest and most loyal supporter ever since. She even got a paralegal degree to be able to help him better with his legal battles. And speaking of legal battles, I have tried so hard to not get too caught up in the insane amount of litigation that went on in this case. Like, we're in 2002 now, so over 20 years since Jeffrey was found guilty of murdering his family. But just know that in the background, all of this time, there was just so much legal action going on. Like, Jeffrey and his lawyers argued everything under the sun. They said that Judge Dupree had been actively biased against him at the trial, that his sentence was too harsh, and that the prosecution had deliberately withheld exculpatory evidence from them. Like, the list is endless. They were just trying their absolute hardest to get Jeffrey free. Jeffrey did end up applying for parole in 2005, 14 years after he first became eligible. But at the hearing, when he refused to admit guilt and claimed that he was factually innocent of murdering his family, his request for parole was denied on the spot. So there's all of this legal action going on, right? It's hectic and it's all unsuccessful. But over time, over the years, Jeffrey's defense team start to fine-tune their approach, and they shift their attention to basically just trying to prove that there were other people in the apartment that night. As DNA testing became more popular, they started pushing for DNA testing of evidence that had been collected at the crime scene, specifically hairs. And it turned out there were a number of hairs, one of them even allegedly found under Kristen's fingernail, that had not been matched to any member of the MacDonald family. Unfortunately for the defense, the hairs also weren't a match for any known suspects, including Helena Stoeckley and her at the time boyfriend, who we spoke about in the last video, Greg Mitchell, who coincidentally, just like Helena, had also passed away from cirrhosis of the liver. But speaking of hairs, there were also 3 blonde saran strands of fake hair found in a hairbrush in the dining room next to Colette's purse. And the defense claims that the prosecution withheld these hairs from them during the trial, which is why they were never mentioned at the time. So the question was, did these hairs provide irrefutable proof of Jeffrey's story that someone wearing a blonde wig was inside the apartment that night? There were also multiple dark woolen fibers found on the club and on Colette's body, the source of which were never found. The defense claimed that this fiber evidence was also withheld from them at the 1979 trial. What if these dark fibers came from a dark jumper or a cap that one of the intruders had been wearing that night? Multiple gloves that all bore traces of blood were also found in the apartment that night, including surgical gloves, dishwashing gloves, and an oven mitt. Did the multiple gloves mean multiple intruders? And there were also 3 drops of candle wax found at the crime scene that did not match any of the candles found in the apartment. I mean, these 3 drops of wax were shown to come from 3 different candles, and neither Jeffrey or Helena had ever mentioned there being more than 1 candle. And one of the drops was a little bit old and dusty and had clearly been there a while, but you get the idea. Jeffrey's defense team were seriously building their case, and they were going to be ready as hell next time they were in court, not caught off guard like they had been in 1979. Catherine, Jeffrey's wife, even went so far to travel to Fayetteville to get Helena's mother to sign an affidavit while she was on her deathbed, saying that Helena had also confessed to her that she had been in the apartment that night. So Jeffrey's team were definitely going all out. And the next big court date was September 2012, when Jeffrey was granted an evidentiary hearing to determine if he was going to be given a new trial. And you better believe that this hearing, just like the Article 32 and just like the trial in 1979, was very dramatic and messy. The main reason Jeffrey had been granted this hearing, along with the DNA and fiber evidence that we spoke about that the defense said proved that intruders had been in the apartment that night, was an affidavit filed in 2005 by a man named Jimmy Britt. Jimmy Britt had passed away in 2008, but in 1979, at the time of Jeffrey's trial, he had been a US Marshal, and he had sworn in this affidavit that he had heard Helena Stoeckley tell Jim Blackburn, the lead prosecutor at the trial, that she had been at the apartment that night and witnessed the murders. And Britt claimed that after Helena told Blackburn this, Blackburn then turned around and said that he would indict her for murder if that was the story she told on the stand. This totally explained why Helena flaked in her testimony at the trial. She was terrified of going to prison. She even mentioned that in her interview with Beasley and Gunderson. In the affidavit, Britt claimed that he had been in charge of driving Helena from a jail in South Carolina to Raleigh, North Carolina, where the trial was being held. And he said during this car ride, Helena had personally also confessed to him the same thing she said to Blackburn later, that she was in the apartment that night and witnessed the murders. The problem was that Britt said that he had picked up Helena from a jail in Greenville, whereas the jail that Helena was actually being held at was in Pickens. But this could have been a simple mix-up, though. I mean, Greenville and Pickens were only about 30 minutes apart. But no, because station records regarding Helena's transport to Raleigh to testify at the trial showed that it was a totally different officer that had transported her. Britt had really only essentially walked her into the courthouse, not driven her 300 miles. At the evidentiary hearing, Jim Blackburn took the stand to defend himself against the claims Jimmy Britt had made in this affidavit. And Blackburn's character was definitely called a little bit into question at this point, because since the 1979 trial, he had actually been disbarred and found guilty of fraud. I think multiple counts of fraud, actually. But Blackburn testified that he absolutely didn't threaten Helena, that when he had shown her pictures of the crime scene before she testified, she had said that she didn't recognize the place and that she didn't think she was there that night. And Blackburn testified that Jimmy Britt wasn't even in the room when this conversation took place. But even if we entertain the theory that Britt was telling the truth, that he was in the room and that he did hear Blackburn telling Helena that he would indict her for murder if she said on the stand that she was present at the time the murders were taking place, it still doesn't actually mean that Blackburn had threatened Helena. Helena had no legal counsel, and so Blackburn was obligated to tell her what would happen if she took the stand and said that she was present at the time of the murders. And the defense could not prove that Helena's testimony would have been any different if Blackburn hadn't allegedly told her that she would be indicted. So that is how the Britt affidavit went down for the defense, like a deflated balloon. And the DNA and fiber evidence we spoke about earlier that they said proved Jeffrey was telling the truth, that there were intruders in the apartment that night, went down about the same. So there was this hair found in Colette's hand at the crime scene, and the defense had just gone on and on about this hair for ages because there was also a splinter from the club found in that same hand. So they claimed that the hair must have come from whoever had attacked Colette with the club. The problem was that this hair wasn't one of the unmatched ones that we had spoken about earlier. DNA testing from back in 2006 had shown that this hair was a limb hair from none other than Jeffrey MacDonald. So this hair that the defense had claimed for so long must have come from the person that attacked Colette had come from Jeffrey. It was Jeffrey's, Lil. It was Jeffrey's. Can you believe that? It was Jeffrey's. And when it came to the unmatched hairs, the prosecution pointed out that the MacDonald family was far from the first family to have lived in that apartment. It was officers' living quarters. Many families had lived in there previously. And the MacDonalds themselves had only lived there about 6 months before the murders. And what about all the people that had been in the apartment in the time the MacDonalds had lived there, like friends and family members and babysitters? There's no way hair samples were taken from all of these people. What I'm saying is, it would have been more strange if there hadn't been unmatched hairs found in that apartment. Also, the 3 saran fiber hair strands found in that hairbrush, not only were they shown to come from 2 different sources, despite Jeffrey only describing one of the intruders wearing a wig, but the prosecution argued what a strange idea it was that this wig-wearing intruder had just randomly picked up a hairbrush they found at the apartment and started brushing their wig while the murders were taking place. They instead suggested it was much more likely that the girls, Kimberly and Kristen, had used that hairbrush to brush the hair of their many dolls, and that's how the strands had ended up in the brush. Unfortunately, the girls' dolls had been disposed of after the Article 32 in 1970, so the saran fibers were never able to be matched. There were also 2 platinum synthetic hairs found on another hairbrush in the apartment, but these were shown to belong to a hairpiece that Colette often wore. But what about those dark woolen fibers, right? For years, the defense claimed that those fibers had come from clothing worn by Helena Stoeckley that night. But while in many of her confessions, Helena had gone into relatively fine detail about what she had been wearing that night, she never once mentioned wearing any dark woolen clothes. These fibers were shown to have come from 3 different sources, and the prosecution argued that the only reason these fibers hadn't been able to be matched to clothing items that belonged to the MacDonalds themselves was because, just like the girls' dolls, most of the family's clothing had been disposed of in 1970 after the Article 32. This evidentiary hearing lasted 7 days, and it was pretty clear from very early on that the prosecution were winning by a landslide. But due to a whole bunch of delays, mostly on Jeffrey's part, to be honest, because he was filing extensions and missing deadlines left, right, and center, it wasn't until nearly a year later that the judge finally made his decision, and that decision was that Jeffrey would not be getting a new trial. Jeffrey then moved on to the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals, and after a whole lot of that legal back and forth that we've already seen in this case, where he filed an appeal, filed for extensions, missed multiple deadlines, in December 2018, the 4th Circuit affirmed the decision made by the District Court. In 2019, the Supreme Court refused to hear Jeffrey's appeal on the 4th Circuit's decision to uphold the decision made by the District Court, and also denied his petition for habeas corpus. And finally, that is very nearly the end of all of the litigation surrounding this case. Flippin' heck. Am I a lawyer yet? But now, today, at age 78, having spent the last 39 years in jail and having exhausted all of his appeals, Jeffrey still continues to proclaim his innocence. His wife, Catherine, even tweeted Donald Trump himself last year while he was still president, angling to get Jeffrey released. Surprisingly, Trump did not reply. Even though Jeffrey's legal battles are still now very likely over, he still managed to get some spotlight in 2020 when FX released a documentary series about the case. case called A Wilderness of Error, based on a book by the same title by Errol Morris. And binging that series in like 2 days straight was my first introduction to this case, FYI. Morris's book was released around the time of the evidentiary hearing in 2012, and he's a celebrated director and author who was previously most well known for his movie Thin Blue Line, which was considered the driving force behind the release of a man who had been wrongfully convicted of murder in 1976. So Jeffrey was probably very excited and hopeful when he found out that Morris was writing a book on his case. But while the book was mostly positively received and was quite popular, it didn't really have any impact on the case itself, something I'm sure would have been very disappointing for both Morris and Jeffrey. Jeffrey, as I mentioned, still refuses to admit that he is guilty of murdering his family. Last year in 2020, he waived his right to 2 parole hearings, but in November, he applied for compassionate release due to health issues. But despite his lawyers arguing that one of the reasons he should be released is these health issues that Jeffrey is suffering, like chronic kidney disease and high blood pressure, put him at much higher risk if he's exposed to COVID. Jeffrey has refused to be vaccinated, something that I'm not even going to touch on or give my opinion on, but I'm just saying I have read that this is not helping his request for compassionate release. There is still yet to be a decision made on whether Jeffrey will or won't be released early, so as of today, as it stands right now, Jeffrey MacDonald is still in prison for the murders of Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen MacDonald. And now that we are all up to date on the case, we are going to move on to final thoughts. Lily girl, are you here for final thoughts? What do you think? Where do you think we should start, Lil? Okay, so I want to start with some evidence that I haven't already mentioned, because there is just so much evidence in this case that if I talked about all of it, we would all be here until we're old and grey. But these are the pieces of evidence that I found really interesting in my research, but I just couldn't find a place to talk about them yet. Firstly, there was a phone number written in pencil on the club used in the murders, which just struck me as so strange. And this phone number belonged to the home of one of Jeffrey's commanding officers. And a woman named Joan Kane, who was this officer's wife, said in a written statement that the night of the murders at about 3:20 to 3:30 a.m., so right before the time Jeffrey made that emergency phone call, she got a phone call from an unknown male caller. And Jones said that she didn't remember much about this call because it woke her up in the middle of the night and she was sleepy. Relatable. The significance here is that the CID were like 130% convinced that Jeffrey's infidelities were way greater than what he was letting on. That it wasn't just this one night stand here and there like he was saying. It was actually a great deal of different women. And they suspected that Joan Kane might have been one of these women. Joan, however, claimed that she had only met Jeffrey on 1 or 2 occasions and that she couldn't think of any reason he would be calling her house at 3 a.m. in the morning. And at the grand jury, when Jeffrey was confronted with the phone number on the club, he said he had no idea why it was there and said that he hadn't called the Kane residence that night. But what a bizarre coincidence, right? The CID never ended up being able to find enough evidence to prove that Jeffrey had been the male caller that night that Joan had spoken to, so they had to let it go. But why did Joan get a phone call in the middle of the night that the murders took place? And why was her number literally written on one of the murder weapons? Like, I don't think you could get any more bizarre than that. And since it's final thoughts and I'm allowed to speculate a little, I just want to add like a different narrative option here. What if the caller was Jeffrey and he hadn't been wanting to speak to Joan at all? He had wanted to speak to her husband, his CO, that after murdering his family, he had wanted to confess to what he had done or maybe wanted some advice. We'll probably never know if Jeffrey was the male caller that Joan spoke to that night, but this phone number on the club was just one of the first things in my research I came across that just blew my mind. The next piece of evidence I want to talk about that I haven't mentioned already is a suitcase that was found sitting on the floor in the master bedroom. This suitcase rarely gets mentioned except in passing, and I think that's because in all of the commotion of the blood evidence and the hairs and the fibers and the struggle scene in the living room, like it just gets lost in the background. But I think this suitcase deserves so much more attention because firstly, I don't think there is a stronger signal of conflict in a relationship than a suitcase. Like, think of all the movies and TV shows you've seen with a couple in it when one of them brings out a suitcase. Like, that's the moment where you're like, oh man, it is definitely over. And although Jeffrey and Colette's marriage was consistently described by their friends and family as a happy one, every marriage has its issues, and this one was no different. Firstly, of course, there was Jeffrey's infidelities, but also, although most people said that the couple were overjoyed to be pregnant again, there were at least a couple of people that said that Jeffrey wasn't happy about having another baby on the way, and even more people that said that Colette really wasn't happy. This suitcase in the apartment was empty, and it was just innocently sitting on the floor in the master bedroom, except not so innocently because it had Colette's blood underneath it, as in it had been moved after she had already been attacked. So there has to be a story behind the suitcase. It's been suggested that maybe after killing his family, Jeffrey wanted to flee the scene and grabbed the suitcase out, and then he changed his mind, but he forgot to put the suitcase back away. Solid theory, but personally, I feel like the suitcase might have been for Colette. During her testimony at the 1979 trial, Mildred Kassab said that she got a phone call from Colette, literally just the morning before the murders took place. And Colette had asked Mildred if she and the girls could come home to visit them in New York, but the Kassabs were in the process of having a pool installed, and knowing that at the time of this phone call, their backyard was just this massive pit, and worried that the girls were going to injure themselves, Mildred told Colette to wait until spring when the pool would be completed. But what if, being so unhappy in the marriage, Colette had already packed the suitcase before she had even called her mother to ask if she and the girls could stay? At the crime scene, there was a stack of children's clothes on the floor in the hallway, just sitting there on the floor. And one of Colette's dresser drawers was found slightly open with everything in there just an absolute mess, like everything had been shoved in there all at once. So what if Jeffrey had found this suitcase and realized that Colette was planning on leaving, even just temporarily, and this was what threw him into this blind rage? And then after the murders, he realized that he needed to cover up the fact that Colette had been planning on leaving. So he grabbed the girls' clothes and just left them in that pile in the hallway, maybe because he couldn't bear going into their bedrooms and seeing their bodies. And then he grabbed Colette's things out of the suitcase and just shoved them in her drawer, accidentally leaving it partly open. Like, is anyone else starting to share my frustration that no one mentions this suitcase? Because it deserves so much more attention. Another thing that frustrates me to no end in this case, and I think I touched on it maybe in the last part, but it's when people say that Jeffrey's story has never changed about that night. Because I'm sorry to argue, but that's not the case. Even Jeffrey himself has admitted that his story has changed. He said that his mother had to correct him once when he was talking to a friend about the murders because he had told her something completely different. So let's get nitpicky and talk about just some of the discrepancies there has been in Jeffrey's story over the years. Firstly, when he was interviewed by the CID in April of 1970, before he knew that he was their prime suspect, he told the investigators he could only remember the night in like flashes, like it was Polaroids or like stop motion, just flashes. And yet months later in the Article 32, he was able on the stand to describe the struggle in great detail, step by step, almost blow for blow. In the days immediately following the murders, Jeffrey had said that this struggle in the living room had moved into the hallway and that is where his PJ top was ripped and ended up over his wrists. It wasn't until months later at the April 1970 CID interview that he said, oh no, actually, it was back in the living room at the start of the struggle that his PJ top ended up entangled over his wrists. In that same interview with the CID, Jeffrey said that he hadn't really stepped foot in the kitchen that night, but months later at the Article 32, probably now knowing the blood evidence that placed him in the kitchen, he said that he had gone in there after he had found the bodies to wash his hands. At the hospital on the night of the murders, Jeffrey said to a friend and an orderly that the female intruder had been wearing white boots. However, that very same night, he said to the CID investigators that the boots had been either black or dark brown. In the Article 32, he said that they were light brown, and the very next year in 71, he said that they were dark red. I will be the first to admit that some of these discrepancies are very nitpicky, but on the 17th of February, so we're talking the day of the murders, Jeffrey told the CID investigators that he had been fighting against 3 male intruders. You know, the story we've heard all of these years. But the very next day, the 18th of February, he changed his story and said that there were 2 male intruders. And we all know that he then went back to there being 3 male intruders, and that's the story he's stuck to. But on the night of the murders at the hospital, 3 different medical staff said that Jeffrey told them that there was 2 black men and 1 white man, not 1 black man and 2 white men like he's maintained in all of the years following. Like, these are some pretty big mix-ups, and not ones you can just blame on Jeffrey's memory fading over time, because they happened so soon after the murders. And this is only the times that Jeffrey's story has shown discrepancies, not when he was caught out in just straight out lies. Like when Jeffrey said that it was Kristen that wet the bed that night, because lab analysis of the bedding showed that the urine did not belong to Kristen, and that instead it had to have come from either Kimberly or Colette. Like straight after the murders, when Jeffrey said he had seen water just dripping off these intruders like they were drenched, despite him not wearing his glasses or his contacts, of course. But the CID could find no puddles or watermarks or anything else that would indicate someone dripping wet being in the apartment that night. Or when Jeffrey said that the black male intruder, who he estimated to be around 5'10 or 5'11, had lifted the club high over his head to attack Jeffrey. But seeing as the ceiling in the living room was only about 7 foot, there was no way it was physically possible for someone of that height to lift the club high over his head the way that Jeffrey described. Or when Jeffrey said he had suffered about 10 ice pick wounds to his abdomen, despite none of these wounds coming up on any hospital documentation, and multiple hospital staff saying that he never suffered any ice pick wounds whatsoever. I mean, I could go on forever, but I'm sure you guys have more important things to do with your day than to hear me spend hours picking apart Jeffrey's story, just, you know, seam by seam. So we are just going to move on to everyone's favorite red herring, Helena Stoeckley. So do I think Helena Stoeckley was in the apartment that night? No. Do I think Helena had been in the MacDonald apartment maybe at some point prior to the murders? Potentially. Helena did claim that she had broken into the apartment a few weeks before the murders to steal valuables. I don't know if this is true. At one point, she also claimed that she had tried to buy drugs off Jeffrey. And at another point, she claimed that she and Jeffrey had been having an affair. I don't know if this is true either. My gut tells me that Helena was a very young, impressionable, at-risk girl, easily influenced by a detective that she thought had her back, Detective Beasley. And I think she was fed details over the years about the murders by both Beasley and Gunderson, Jeffrey's PI. Seeing as Helena was pretty well known around Fayetteville, I thought for a little while that maybe Jeffrey knew Helena and that he had actually targeted her when he described the female intruder wearing the blonde wig and the big floppy hat. But Jeffrey didn't recognize Helena's photo when he was shown it in 1970 and 1979. And the sketches of the female intruder that Jeffrey described that he had had a very big role in having made, in my opinion, look nothing like Helena. But despite all of this, Jeffrey would later claim that it was definitely Helena that had been in the apartment that night, walking around with her candle and chanting "Acid is groovy" and "Kill the pigs." When it came to that interview that Helena did in the 80s with Beasley and Gunderson, I know I already spoke about how there's just so many things wrong with it, but there is still a couple of things worth noting. Firstly, in all of the confessions that she had made over the years, Helena had never once made any reference to a phone call she answered at the apartment that night before that interview, which conveniently took place after Beasley and Gunderson had been made aware of Fry's statements in 1970 1979, where he claimed to have made a call to the MacDonald apartment that night. Both Beasley and Gunderson also had serious monetary interest in getting this taped confession out of Helena. Not only was Gunderson being paid like $100 an hour to investigate and try and clear Jeffrey's name, but both of them were in the midst of talks of movie deals and book deals about the case. So I'm pretty sure they both just looked at Helena and saw dollar signs. Another question I had playing in my head while watching this interview was if Helena had actually been threatened by Blackburn in the 1979 trial, like Jimmy Britt claimed, don't you think she would have mentioned that specifically in this interview that took place 4 years later? I will say that I'm so thankful that Freddie and Mildred Kassab fought so hard for justice for Colette and the girls, because otherwise this case might have turned out completely differently. I will also say that the majority of people that believe Jeffrey is guilty are quite quick to dismiss any argument to the contrary, but I personally can totally understand why someone might believe he's innocent. There's the seriously botched investigation, for one. Like, it's incredible that despite all of the CID's stuff-ups at the crime scene, that there was still enough evidence to convict Jeffrey. But there's also the fact that it makes zero sense. It makes no sense that this man, who had no history of violence whatsoever and was seen by all of his friends and family as this amazing father and husband and doctor, just snapped one day and brutally murdered his family like this. I still struggle to wrap my mind around it. And there's no happy ending in this case either, no matter what you believe, because you either have to believe that Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen were murdered by the one person that was supposed to love and cherish and protect them, or you have to believe that Colette and the girls were killed by these intruders that were never caught, and then Jeffrey was falsely convicted and imprisoned for their murders for 40 years. Like, there's no winners here. I'd like to finish up by once again thanking Barbara for suggesting this case, and I loved her email as well because the case was just instantly personalized. She said that she had always felt a connection to Kimberly because she was the same age, and she said that her mother had always believed that Jeffrey was innocent because he was too handsome. Such a mum thing. Barbara didn't share whether she thinks Jeffrey MacDonald is guilty or not, so that'll be interesting. Hopefully we came to the same conclusion, but as usual, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this case. Do you think Jeffrey MacDonald is guilty or not, and why? Or is there a bit of evidence I didn't talk about that to you is what the suitcase is to me? Mention it in the comments down below and I'll do my best to explain myself. And that is it. That is the end of our deep dive into the MacDonald family murders. If you've made it this far, you are either crazy or incredible. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and Lily today. We appreciate it so much as usual. If you enjoyed this series, remember to give it a like down below. I hope you have a fabulous week, and me and Lily will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye. Head scratches.
But I have to stay afloat. It's not easy. Be a person.